Hello, I'm Ro Randall. This is the second in a series of short videos about climate psychology, about how we respond to the climate crisis emotionally. This one's about climate anxiety, which, for reasons which I'll explain, I prefer to call climate distress. I was talking to a young man recently who was telling me that he couldn't stop thinking about the climate crisis. It was constantly in his thoughts. He couldn't sleep. He was beginning to have difficulty eating regularly. He scoured the internet for every last scrap of news that he could find about climate. And he found that when he tried to speak to his parents about how he was feeling, they tried to reassure him, and this left him feeling even more isolated and even more alone. I also meet parents of young children, who tell me how frightened they are about the future which they see opening up before their kids. And I meet older people who talk to me about how they feel overwhelmed by feelings of shame and of guilt about the fact that they've only really just allowed this issue to take a proper place in their thoughts and their feelings. And most of these people are feeling very, very distressed in one way or another. And this is what is currently popularly being called climate anxiety. And I prefer not to call it that. I prefer to call it climate distress for a number of reasons. The first is that many of the feelings which people describe are appropriate to hearing something which is very bad news, to letting it come properly into your life. It's not going to make you feel wonderful. It's going to make you feel bad. So the first thing to say is that these feelings are appropriate. And the second thing to say is that they are much, much wider than feelings of anxiety. And I think by calling it just anxiety, we also tend to pathologize it, and we make it into something which psychotherapists or psychiatrists ought to deal with, rather than something which belongs to all of us, to humanity at large. Exactly how you respond to really allowing yourself to understand what climate change is will depend a lot on your own personal history. For some people, it's something they get over quite quickly. They find a way through it. For other people, it's permanently unsettling. Some people experience it as very traumatic, others as less so. But I think what everybody has in common is a sense of suddenly being faced with something which is life-threatening and life-changing. And I think that on the whole, you can see that there are two stages in the experiences people have. And the first stage, I think, is that moment where you stop keeping it out of consciousness. When you allow yourself to properly think about the implications, you let it into your heart. And this is a point where people feel shock, they feel overwhelmed, they often feel very frightened, they often describe feeling powerless and not knowing what to do, not knowing where to turn. Some people describe feeling really quite despairing at this stage. But as their engagement with this issue carries on, people also start to describe other feelings which are perhaps slightly more long-lasting and slightly harder to struggle with as well, because they describe everything that goes with coping with what is actually a life-changing realization. So people start to question their own identity, the things which they thought they wanted out of life, and their purpose in life. And this can be really quite serious. People also describe experiencing terrible grief and sorrow, and some of this is grief about the life that you won't lead because of climate change, the life that's got to change because of it. And some of it is grief about the things which you see all around you which are disappearing, the fact that there are no longer frogs or hedgehogs in your garden, the fact that there are no longer insects splattered on your windscreen when you drive in the summer, the fact that the seasons seem upside down wherever you look all over the world. And there are the questions of guilt and shame, which I think afflict a lot of us in what I call the overdeveloped world, where we are complicit and have been complicit for a very long time in everything that is going wrong with the climate. And I think that these kinds of feelings are worse now than they were previously. They're very familiar to me from my first work, my first psychological work with people about climate change over 15 years ago. But I think that the intensity and urgency of the climate crisis, the fact that very little has been done to alleviate what seems to be happening, means that people are now feeling these same sorts of things but with greater desperation. I think it's also true that in the UK, 10 years of austerity have left this feeling that the wider support systems of the state and society have been hollowed out and can no longer be relied on. And I think this has a psychological effect. It makes us all feel thrown back on ourselves and on our own resources. And this is not good when you're trying to cope with something very serious psychologically. And finally, I think there are the difficulties for people who are emerging from this state of disavowal, from this state of having tried very hard to defend yourself against the reality of climate change. And I think it's very important to understand that defending yourself against this is also, it's a normal thing to do. We can't always take what reality throws at us, and we shouldn't be surprised that many of us have tried not to face it. There are a lot of things which we can do to help ourselves and to help others in this situation. And I think the first thing that anybody who is suffering from this kind of climate distress needs is to be heard, is to be able to talk, to have somebody who will listen to you as you struggle to articulate what it is that you're feeling, someone who's willing to walk beside you as you go through this. One of the other things which I often say to people is that it's important gradually to find your way to what it is that you think you're going to do about it. People sometimes think that we all have to be out on the streets, and I think it's really important that people are. But there are a lot of other things which people can get involved in, from simply writing to your MP or getting involved in a bit of clicktivism online, to involving yourself in all kinds of campaigns which will ameliorate some of the effects of climate change, whether that's to do with air quality or to do with food. And I think one of the most important things which may make you feel personally better is when you adjust your life to what you now know, when you actually decide that there are certain things you're not going to do anymore and certain things which you're going to change, that you're going to live a life which is congruent with the reality that you've now let into your heart. I think those things can all help. And I think it can also help when you reach that point where you can stop looking at the climate news. Once you know how bad it is, you don't need to torture yourself with that every day. You need to be in a place where you can also get on with the rest of your life and still find joy in your family, in activities which don't use up a lot of carbon dioxide, don't have high emissions, spend time in nature, in meditation, in doing the other kinds of things which make life meaningful. So it's important, I think, to recognise that there is a place the other side of the acute climate distress that you're feeling. And in the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the kinds of processes that people typically seem to go through when they're struggling to manage climate distress.